On September 28, the U.S. House of Representatives passed the Cambodia Democracy Act, which aims to put sanctions on Cambodian officials who violate human rights in Cambodia and undermine democracy. This happened less than a month before Cambodia celebrates the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement. The agreement aimed to bring peace to Cambodia, development, and respect for human rights. In the last 4 years, Cambodia has made it hard for human rights defenders and opposition parties to operate freely in the country. VOA Khmer has invited Mr. Gareth Evans, former Australian Foreign Minister and one of the initiators of the Paris Peace Agreement, to share his view on the implementation, on the achievements and challenges of the Paris Peace Agreement. Good morning, Professor Honorable Gareth Evans. How are you, sir?
Good morning. A great pleasure to talk to you, Kimseng.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking your very busy time to talk to VOA Khmer service on the 30th anniversary of the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement. 30 years after the signing of this historical document, which aimed to end civil war in Cambodia, bring peace and democracy and human rights to Cambodia, what should be celebrated on that day?
What should be celebrated is obviously the bringing of peace to Cambodia. After years of terrible war, invasion, genocide, civil war again, in which, as we know, nearly 2 million people died, either executed outright by the Khmer Rouge or died of malnutrition or died of disease. After years of suffering and displacement, the peace process and the Paris agreements did bring peace to Cambodia, lasting peace. It has meant the return of hundreds of thousands, nearly 400,000 displaced people from the Thai border. It has meant the disappearance of the Khmer Rouge. It took some time, but it happened. It has meant the capacity of this issue, which was a running sore in regional diplomacy and indeed global diplomacy, to disappear as an issue of that kind. And it did create the conditions in which Cambodia could build a flourishing country and an economically stable country, as well as a peaceful country for the future. All of that is to be celebrated. That is wonderful. And that's still durable. But there's a very big but. On the democracy and human rights side of the equation, where our hopes were also very high indeed, that the future would be a bright one for Cambodia, we have been profoundly disappointed. It's been a terrible record, starting with the 1993 election and Hun Sen's refusal to accept the outcome, which the international community, unfortunately, did not push back hard enough against. The rest of the story we can talk about, but it's a very sad one. So it's a challenge, looking back 30 years, to build on those foundations that were laid, but there's a big job ahead of us because the record has been very, very sad on those fronts.
Thank you so much, sir. In your presentation in 2012, and I quote, you said that the glass is still only at best half full. In democracy and human rights terms, Cambodia still has a long way to go before it can stand proudly in the rank of those nations who can credibly claim to fully respect both. So right now, some human rights defenders and democracy promoters like NDI and IRI have expressed their disappointment over the state of democracy in Cambodia and the respect for human rights. The trend has been backsliding in the last 4 years. In your opinion, what went wrong?
Well, as I said in 1991 at the Paris Peace Conference, when as Australian Foreign Minister I was signing so proudly those accords, peace and freedom are not prizes which once won can never be lost. They have to be won again each day. And you have to lay the foundations with a strong society, strong economy, strong democracy, and above all, respect for human rights. That's what I said in 1991. And what went wrong is that simply was not respected. The international community basically lost interest in Cambodia, believing that the peace had been won. And Hun Sen steadily, over time, built what was an unstable democratic foundation at the beginning into a fully fledged autocracy. Let's face it, that's what we now have, with the banning of political parties, the repression of opposition leaders, human rights violence periodically, murderous violence when other forms of repression have put and it's a very sad story. I mean, human rights defenders have fought very, very hard right from the beginning. And it's a wonderful story. The story of their contribution has been wonderfully told in a book your listeners might be familiar with, edited by Sue Coffey, now available in Khmer, about the story of Cambodia's human rights defenders. But the truth of the matter is we do have some very brave people within the country as well as in the diaspora who are continuing to work to expose what has gone wrong, to get it out to a wider international audience, and to keep the morale of Cambodians up, which is crucial for the longer term. You've got to stay optimistic about these things. Wheels do turn. Presidents do eventually go away. Prime ministers go away. The wheels turn. But, you know, it can be very grueling to live with these situations while they're happening. And it's not a happy situation at the moment.
Cambodian diaspora community have been petitioning their governments who were signatory of the Paris Peace Agreement, but so far there seemed to be very little action from their leaders. So what advice do you have for them to get their voices heard louder, or what kind of recommendation do you have for them to address the remaining issues, technically human rights and democracy?
Well, I don't think there is much chance of reconvening the Paris conference, which some of the activists have been arguing for some time now. It's been 30 years ago since that conference was held. The circumstances have changed. People have got other preoccupations. And moreover, even if it was reconvened, the powers of such a conference would really only be to refer concerns to the UN. Back to the UN system, and the UN system is already, in a sense, addressing these concerns to some extent through the Human Rights Council, through the special rapporteurs, which were established right at the beginning and still have a role. I think that the critical thing is just to keep drawing attention to what is happening within the country and how much of it is so unprincipled, so undemocratic, so unrespectful of human rights. To draw that attention to the international community, to constantly use every forum that's available, bilateral, regional, global, through the NGO organizations and through the activists, to just bring to the attention of governments, sympathetic governments, those signatories of Paris, to bring to their attention, you know, what is going wrong. I think it's very important that governments pass Magnitsky Acts, those laws which make it possible to impose sanctions, targeted sanctions, financial sanctions, travel sanctions, sanctions stopping the education in our countries of the children of the leadership. All those things can be very important. Australia has dragged its feet on that. It's the subject of a discussion in the National Parliament at the moment. Other countries have those laws on the books. They need to be enforced. They need to be enacted and enforced. And I think if activists continue to add pressure to be applied, it will over time have its effect. Nothing's going to happen quickly. Nothing's going to happen urgently. That's the unhappy reality. But I think you can be very confident about the future of the country because there is such a large cohort of young people in the country. It's one of the youngest countries in Southeast Asia in terms of the average age of the population, I think mid-20s. And, you know, you do have a really vibrant community as well as a vibrant diaspora around the world. And it's that resource which you have to take advantage of. Ultimately, the solution for Cambodia's problems, I'm afraid, is going to have to come from within Cambodia itself. There's only so much that outsiders, you know, can do with so many other preoccupations in this rather volatile world at the moment. But I'm confident about the longer term, but the short term, it's going to be hard.
The EU and the US have applied some sanctions, including targeted sanctions on individuals who are close to Prime Minister Hun Sen, and also a partial withdrawal of the trade preference of the European Union. It's called Everything But Arms. But Prime Minister Hun Sen doesn't seem to slow down his crackdown on human rights defenders and activists because of a strong backing from China. So what else should be done?
Well, the China factor is obviously very important. It's been giving such very, very strong financial support and political support to the Hun Sen regime. I think I've said quite often in my speeches and writing that unhappily Cambodia today seems like a wholly owned subsidiary of China. It's jumping to the Chinese tune. It's completely in the pocket of China because of a huge indebtedness and huge body of investment and economic commitment by China in Cambodia. So that's the reality we have to live with. That's working itself out in terms of divisions within ASEAN, which are not helpful in maintaining solidarity. And it's a difficult story. But that said, I think there are ways of building alternative forms of pressure because Hun Sen, because Cambodia has that backstop of China. It's not going to be easy for economic sanctions or anything like that of a general kind to have an effect. But personally targeted sanctions on assets, on travel and so on, they can make a difference. People do they find that painful and hurtful over time, and some pain is capable of being inflicted by other countries in the international community, and I don't think we should stop short of applying that pain. It's going to take time. It's going to take and maybe it's going to have to wait until Hun Sen moves on, but that will happen eventually, and that will be a big occasion for change within the country, because I don't think anyone wants to see a family dynasty now being established there.
Would the future be good for Cambodia as it has moved closer and closer to China? Past experiences have shown that it didn't work really well for Cambodia. What makes it different this time around?
Well, obviously the pressure is going to continue to be there for Cambodia to maintain that very close relationship with China, because it has a very high level of indebtedness, has a very high level of economic dependence, and China has been very supportive of Cambodia politically. That dynamic is not going to change. What you have to do is establish another dynamic working alongside that and pushing in the other direction. What you have to push for is ASEAN solidarity for the other countries to call out human rights violations. Unfortunately, that has not been happening in recent years, and many other ASEAN countries have been going backwards in human rights and democracy terms. Thailand, Philippines, obviously Myanmar. So it's going to be difficult to counter that balance that present reality that you describe. It's going to be difficult, but it's not impossible. You just have to continue working at it, to stay optimistic, to keep the information coming out as to what is going on, so that nobody can pretend they don't know about these violations. The land rights violations, the freedom of assembly violations, the freedom of speech violations, the freedom of political party establishment violations, and just the personal integrity and people being able to protest without fear of being killed. All of that stuff has to keep on coming out. And because people's attention wavers, dissipates over time, it's very hard to keep people focused with so many other things going on in the region and the world. But if that core group of unhappy people within the country and the core group within the diaspora continue to articulate the nature of the problems, the nature of the political environment, the unacceptability of it, and continue to work to bring those concerns to the attention of sympathetic governments, then over time it will, I believe, have an effect. You can't stop because of frustration. The frustration has been building up now for 30 years, and I understand it. But there's no easy, no quick fixes. You just have to keep working away.
In 2012, Cambodia chaired the regional group ASEAN, but it didn't do really well. And next year, again, Cambodia will resume the chairmanship of ASEAN. Do you think ASEAN will be united or divided?
Well, ASEAN is already very divided. Already very, very divided. You see that over the South China Sea issue. You see it over the degree of willingness to take action of any useful kind in relation to Myanmar. There are real divisions, and ASEAN is in danger of becoming, irrelevant. ASEAN will continue to be very important as a kind of glue stopping the countries of the organisation from resolving their disagreements violently. ASEAN continues to be an extremely important peace organisation from that point of view, but that's a very limited point of view. ASEAN is also important from an economic cooperation point of view and other things that have happened to build ASEAN strength, internally. But in terms of dealing with difficult human rights issues, dealing with the need to maintain solidarity in the face of external pressures that are building up, China's overreach in particular in the South China Sea. What I say about Australia's activity in the region is that as much as I love ASEAN and have worked with it so effectively, including at the time of the peace accords, the reality is that the future for Australia, I think, lies in working with individual countries, Indonesia, Vietnam, strong countries, Singapore in its own way, that do have competence and credibility and are capable of decent policy initiatives, hoping for solidarity so long as ASEAN maintains this unanimity rule, where everybody has to agree before anything is agreed. That's just hopeless. ASEAN is going to have to, if it's going to hold together at all and going to do anything useful at all when it comes to these difficult problems, it is going to have to adopt a majority voting rule and stop making it possible for spoiler countries, and Cambodia has become a big spoiler country, to stop that unanimity, that effective response when difficult issues arise.
Now, on the Paris Peace Agreement, looking back, what could have been done to make things right from the start?
I think the Paris Peace Agreement is still a very good map for the future of the country. It did everything right in terms of bedding down the peace process, in terms of bringing the civil war to an end and getting everybody signed up to the necessary things that had to happen. It was perfectly good in what it said about democracy, perfectly good in what it said about human rights, about the principles that were relevant and about the steps that needed to be taken. And of course, all those elements of the Paris peace agreements were, in fact, the key elements were embodied in the Cambodian constitution that was enacted after the 1993 election. So I think, the roadmap was there. I don't think you should go back and say the problem lies with the Paris Peace Accords not doing this or not doing that. I think the Paris Peace Accords were fine. They touched every base. They drew the map for the future. What's happened, of course, is that internally that map has not been followed, and there has been not enough international pressure. I think if you want to be critical of the Paris peace players, the real criticism needs to be directed against all of us for not reacting more strongly in the aftermath of that 1993 election. It was a brilliantly successful election. I've never been more personally moved in my life than watching those long queues of grannies and little children and people. Even though they feared there would be Khmer Rouge bomb attacks and so on, they lined up, and there was something like 99%, I think, voting turnout. It was fantastic. But what happened, of course, is Hun Sen, who expected to win the election, clearly did not. He kicked up a huge fuss, and the international community accommodated him, allowed him to become equal prime minister, and that gave him, obviously, confidence to tear up so many of the other principles, as he has done over the years ahead. So yes, we failed in that respect, but it was not a problem with the language of the peace agreements themselves. The language was fine. The map is still there.
In your opinion, what should political parties and civil society organizations do to prepare new generation leaders to carry this task forward?
Well, obviously education is absolutely critical. The young kids coming through, the younger generation, has to be made aware of the country's history, the terrible traumas that were there in the past and the way in which they were overcome through international cooperation and internal commitment to getting things right. that story has to get into their heads, and they have to understand just the significance, obviously, of democracy and human rights for their own future. How you do that inside the country at the moment with an education system that is dominated by a government that's very unsympathetic to human rights and democracy is very hard. Social media is a vehicle, obviously, from the diaspora, from outside, getting in those messages, getting around to the younger generation as to what the issues are and what the problems are and what the potential solutions are. But it's difficult, and nobody pretends otherwise. But somehow, you've just got to keep on working away at educating that younger generation, because the mood is there, the competence is there, the commitment is there. Cambodians have shown themselves to be an incredibly resilient people, an incredibly courageous people. And I just don't think they're going to tolerate indefinitely being denied their food. It's just intolerable. And the younger generation, I think, instinctively will get that, provided we can find the external community, the diaspora, provided civil society organisations, provided you can all find ways of just getting those messages through. So, I mean, people of my generation don't really get it about social media and all the channels and so on that are available, but your generation does. And I think they're the messages that have to get through.
If I may ask a personal question, sir, what do you think of Prime Minister Hun Sen? He respected you so much at one point in the past.
Well, I respected Hun Sen at one point. We were brothers. We called each other brothers. We went through a very difficult negotiation period when Australia initiated the whole peace process with Indonesia. We took it forward. I had many discussions with Hun Sen. He was a tough guy then, as he's remained, but then he saw the utility of working with countries like Australia and finding a solution. And he was flexible, and he delivered. He delivered, of course, because he was confident that in doing so he would have a permanent future as probably the leader of the country. And as soon as he was disappointed with that election result, the rot started to set in. I retained for another decade or so a degree of confidence that at the end of the day, Hun Sen, because of his sheer ability and competence, would eventually see the necessity to accept democratic principles, human rights, work fully within those constraints and deliver effective government. But of course, nearly a decade or so ago, it became obvious that he was just not going to change. And when his actions started taking the form, of actually murdering his, I felt that it was just impossible to continue having any kind of personal support for him. So I've been very critical of him since, and he, of course, has been very critical of me, and we've had some famous confrontations, including on stage in Phnom Penh a few years ago, which disconcerted a lot of people. He's waving his fist and telling me that I was an unacceptable presence in the country. But that's fine. I can cope with that. The important thing is that the message gets through that, Hun Sen, for all his competence, for all that he contributed back, and he contributed a huge amount to bring those peace accords together, but he has turned into a complete autocrat. He has not been good for the country. He needs to go.
Thank you so much, Professor Honorable Gareth Evans, for taking your time to talk to VOA Khmer. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure.